So let's think then about what was going on at the time that Jesus is born, because that's where we begin the New Testament, right? We begin the New Testament at the time of the birth of Jesus. And given that, it will help us to understand, what was going on. And so there were essentially four pillars of Second Temple Judaism. And if we can think about those pillars, I think that it will help us to understand Jesus as we learn about his life in the New Testament. The four pillars are nation, the nation of Israel; Torah, the obedience to the laws of God; temple, the respect for the temple; and monotheism. There is no God but God. The Lord our God is one. All four of those things were things that the Jewish people simply, and when I say the Jewish people, I mean a majority of them, because obviously there's no monolithic Jewish people. But in that time, the people of Israel simply said, these seem to be the four things that we're unwilling to compromise on. Now, when you realize that those are the four things that they were unwilling to compromise on, then you begin to think them through and ask, well, how would Jesus' ministry have affected that? How would Jesus' ministry have affected the love of the nation of Israel? It might have made people mad, because Jesus comes along and says, sure, God loves Israel, but there's a lot of people outside Israel that God loves as well. And Israel is God's people, but God's people are those people who love me. And so there is this new Israel that the Apostle Paul speaks about, the Israel of God. That's not something that most Jewish people would have been happy to hear in that time. The second sort of pillar of Second Temple Judaism is Torah. That is obedience to the law of God. If you have ever lived near a synagogue, a very conservative synagogue, you'll see on Saturday, you'll see Jewish people walking along, ladies and gentlemen with their little children, walking along to the synagogue. It's not that they don't have a car. They think that driving their car would be wrong on the Sabbath. And because they believe that God has made the Sabbath to keep holy, they walk there to the synagogue. Now, when you see that kind of rigid adherence to the law, and then you hear Jesus coming along and saying, circumcision doesn't make as much difference as you thought. In fact, Paul says it means almost nothing. Or when Jesus comes along and says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Man is more important than the Sabbath. Well, these are all laws of God. And to start questioning them, to start saying, you can eat whatever you want. And it's not sinful to eat whatever you want. Well, it was shocking at the very least to them. And then, of course, the third pillar is temple. And remember, Jesus seems to, and there's a lot of work on this, I'll have to just tell you very quickly, but Jesus seems to go into the temple when he performs his temple action, what the scholars call his temple action. That is, he goes into the temple and cleanses it, drives people out. Many New Testament scholars today will argue that that is, in fact, an acted parable. That is, Jesus is acting out a parable. And the parable is that this temple is going to be destroyed. And that if you were depending upon the temple for your salvation, or if you're depending upon the temple for your status and standing with God, then you're going to be disappointed. Well, saying that the temple was going to be torn down and destroyed did not bring Jesus a lot of friends. And then, of course, the fourth pillar is monotheism. From the very time that a little Jewish child is born, they grow up saying the Shema, right? The Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Now think about that. You've said that the Lord your God is one every day for your whole life. Your father has said that every day for his whole life. Your grandfather has said that every day for his whole life. Your great-grandmother has said that. And yet this person comes along and he's walking around Galilee saying, you can pray to me too. I'll accept your prayer. I'll offer you forgiveness. He's doing all of the things that God was doing. And all of a sudden, this idea of monotheism becomes questionable, right? Because if Jesus is God, then there can't be monotheism, because there's God the Father, who is clearly in the Hebrew Bible not this man who's walking around here on earth. And as a result, scholars later on have pounded out the doctrine of the Trinity, which is clearly taught in the New Testament. It's not nearly so clearly explained, and obviously it's a doctrine that comes with all kinds of issues with it. But you can see how this idea of the Trinity, or the Trinitarian God, might have confused people who had grown up with monotheism. And as a result of that, they begin to say, this guy can't be God. In fact, the very idea that Jesus is called God in the first century is so counterintuitive that scholars today say there must have been something exceptional about his life. For Jewish people who had grown up saying the Shema to say that he is God, something incredible must have happened. Well, we call it the resurrection, but other people call it other things, but something incredible did happen. And Jesus was all of those things. He was those pillars of Second Temple Judaism. They just did not realize it. So let's move along and think about now the actual New Testament itself. I think it's time for us. We've done enough in terms of understanding what's going on. Let's think about the New Testament itself. First of all, we want to ask ourselves, what's the name? What does the name mean? New Testament. Well, when I was in Greece, I read Greek and teach Greek, but I don't speak Greek. And the Greek that's spoken today is much different from the Greek New Testament Greek that I read. But I would try to listen and catch words when I was in Greece looking at manuscripts. I would try to listen, catch things here and there. And every time that some Greek person was introducing me, I kept hearing the term kaine diatheke, kaine diatheke. And I realized they're saying New Testament. They're telling them that I teach New Testament. So kaine means new, diatheke means covenant. So New Testament is sort of the new covenant. Because remember, last week we talked about the new covenant that's coming, that is promised to us by God's prophets. Now the new covenant is here in Jesus Christ. And so the Christian scriptures teach us about this new covenant. And this comes into English as the term New Testament, but it's you understand, New Covenant, New Testament, whatever the case may be. So let's take a quick minute and talk a little bit about the text of the New Testament, because the New Testament was originally written in Greek, Koine Greek. Koine means common. And the reason that we have Koine Greek is that Alexander took people for his army from all over that area of the world, most of whom spoke Greek, but they spoke different dialects of Greek. And as a result, they got together, and the language language in general devolves. It gets less complicated. And so The Koine Greek is the common Greek that became less complicated. The New Testament is written in that particular Greek. And for the first 1,600 years, of course, the 1450, the New Testament was written down by hand. And so if you wanted a copy of the book of Matthew, you paid a person to make the paper, make the ink, make the pen, and copy for you a book of Matthew. And as you can imagine, that was expensive. And so a lot of people didn't have a copy of the Bible or a copy of any part of the Bible. And we have today in our possession over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, handwritten Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. It's difficult to tell exactly how many, and I won't go into why, because it's you don't need to know. If you want to know, you can look up textual criticism. But in essence, what we find, and this is, let me say that this is a vastly oversimplified statement, and that if I had time, I would flesh it out a great deal more. And there will be people who will disagree with me and say that I don't know what I'm talking about, but bear with me. The New Testament today, the Greek New Testament that we have today, is virtually the same as the Greek New Testament that was written. Have there been some changes that have crept in as a result of copyist error? Probably. Do they make any difference? The untold majority of textual variants, that is, places where one manuscript varies from the other, have no bearing upon theology or history or philosophy. It might be something as simple as the word "the" in front of a name. It might be something as simple as a spelling issue. So all of that to say that the New Testament that we have today, by and large, we can be certain that it was what was written by the authors. And if you want to know more about that, I teach a class on textual criticism. Glad to talk about that, but you need to learn Greek too. But I teach a class on Greek, so we've got it all covered. Lots of stuff going on. Here again is a map, and this is a map of Israel during Christ's time. That is, you can see different areas split up. And one of the things that I wanted you to see was up at the top of the map, you see Galilee, right there around the Sea of Galilee. You see that Galilee, that's where Jesus grew up, right? They came down into Bethlehem, but that's not where he was from. He grew up in Nazareth. He's called Jesus of Nazareth, but he grew up in Galilee. Whenever he needs to come to Jerusalem, he travels down from Galilee. And so you can see that temple is pretty far south of Galilee. Now, I don't think that Israel's a giant country. It's not. It's a small country. Smaller in length, much smaller in length than the state of Florida. Maybe a little bit wider, but not a lot wider. And so it's not like we couldn't get from one end to the other in a car in a day. Easily we could. But when you're walking or riding a burro, then it becomes much more difficult. So what about the books that are in the New Testament? How do we know today that the books that we have are the ones that God inspired for us to have in the New Testament? This is an issue called canonicity, and there will be another talk about it later on in this whole area and this whole group of talks. It'll be by my colleague, Dr. Scotty Maynard, who's an expert in this area. But what you're seeing on the screen is really just a breaking down of early lists of books of the New Testament. And what you'll find is that by and large, they're all the same. There are a few differences in what are sometimes called the disputed books, like James and Hebrews. But by and large, and looking at this chart should convince you of this, there was no controversy about the 27 books of the New Testament. Now, one of the interesting things that I like to think about is what is it that the church, and when I say the church, I mean the church universal, every Christian. What is it that every Christian agrees on in terms of theology? Not much, not very much, but interestingly, the one thing that almost all churches agree on are the books of the New Testament. You're not going to find a New Testament different if you go into a Roman Catholic church. You're not going to find a different New Testament if you go into a Lutheran church, or if you go into a Presbyterian church or a Baptist church. And that ability of the church to agree on those 27 books is great comfort to me. That's very clear, in my mind at least, that God is overseeing that process. So before we look at the actual books of the New Testament, let's talk a little bit about some of the genres of the New Testament. What is genre? Genre is a way of saying the kind of a book that it is. So if you were reading Harry Potter, the genre would be a novel. If you were reading The Raven, the genre would be a poem, right? If you were reading a newspaper, the genre would be recent history or something like that. And you realize that you read Harry Potter and The Raven differently than you read the newspaper. Because we intuitively, in our minds are able to determine just by reading what the kind of genre is. The problem is when we get to genres that are 2,000 years old and we're not familiar with them, and it's at that point that we run into trouble misunderstanding the text of the New Testament. So let's think about what we have in the New Testament. First of all, we have the Gospels. Now we can ask exactly what is a gospel and why do we have so many of them? A fair and interesting question that we'll talk about a little as we go along. But the Gospels are essentially a book telling us about Jesus. It's not exactly a biography of Jesus, right? Because two of them don't have any birth narratives. They begin when Jesus is an adult. So it's not a biography exactly, but it's something like that. It's a historical book about a person. Then following that, we have the book of Acts, which is a hinge of the New Testament. It's a historical account, but it's also a hinge. Because think about, at the end of the Gospels, what do you have? Jesus saying to Peter, stop acting so jealous. And there are a lot of things that happened that we don't learn about from the Gospels. If it were not for the book of Acts, you would start reading from John all of a sudden to Romans, and you might say, wait a second, Paul, who is that? Never heard of him before. Don't know what that's about. So the Acts sort of gives us that hinge that moves from the time when Christ is on earth to the epistles. Then after Acts, there are letters. And there are lots of subgenres in the letters. By that I mean the book of Philemon is a different kind of letter than the book of 1 Corinthians, clearly. But they're both letters. And we could clearly understand a lot about the letters by reading them. But what I'm going to try to do when we get to them is give you some specific tips for reading ancient letters that I think will be very helpful to you. So first, I want us to ask, why are there 4 Gospels? You ever thought about that? There aren't 4 different people writing to the Romans. There aren't 4 different books of James. But there are 4 Gospels. Why is that? There have been a variety of answers to that down through the ages, but in general, we understand that the Gospels, each of the Gospels, points us toward a different aspect of the life of Jesus, or a different way of looking at the Savior. They're not all just telling us the same story. Now, one of the things that you might have noticed is that 3 of the Gospels seem to be telling a lot of the same story, and one of them doesn't. Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to be telling basically the same story. Not exactly, but they tell us about Jesus' baptism. They tell us about Jesus' temptation. They tell us about Jesus' crucifixion. John, on the other hand, doesn't have any of those stories that we find in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. John doesn't have any of those parables that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He doesn't have any of those demons that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So it's a very interesting difference. The Gospels they're pointing us in different kinds of directions, as genre does. And so the 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic Gospels, S-Y-N, syn, and optic. Syn means together, like synthesize or anything like that. Optic means to see. So synoptic means to see together. And in theology, the synoptics refer to Matthew and Mark and Luke, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it refers to those Gospels as the synoptics because of the fact that they're basically seeing the same event, but they're telling about it a little differently. And so the careful reader, when you read the synoptics, will realize that the 3 synoptics are telling basically the same story. They're telling the story of Jesus. And when you read the synoptic Gospels together, particularly in their original Greek, I believe it's impossible not to come to the conclusion that there's some sort of literary dependence between them. That is, that there's something happened. One gospel was written early and another of the Gospels knew about it, or maybe Mark wrote and Matthew knew about Mark and used that as sort of an outline for his gospel. We don't know exactly how all that worked out. It's something called the synoptic problem, which I'm not going to talk about. You can look it up. But in essence, it's the question of why are these both the same and different? Because realize there are places, let's say for example, we were going to talk about the baptism of Jesus. Occurs in all 3 of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If we were to look at Mark's version of the Gospel, this is what Mark says in Mark 1, 10, and 11. And just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens splitting apart and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my one dear Son, in you I take great delight." Now, what I want you to pay special attention to is what I have underlined, and that is, "You are my one dear Son." That's what the voice says in Mark, "You are my one dear Son." In Matthew, the voice says, and here's Matthew 3:17, a voice from heaven said, "This is my one dear Son. In him I take delight." So in Mark, it's "You are my one dear Son." In Matthew, it's "This is my one dear Son." And so a fundamentalist question would be, what did the voice say? Because we've got to make all these things fit together. And I don't think that's what it's there for. A literary question will ask, why do Matthew and Mark report different things? I believe that the event happened historically. Let's begin with that. Obviously, Jesus was baptized, a voice came from heaven. I believe all that. But the fact that Matthew and Mark describe the voice from heaven with different words indicates that there's something going on there. And if we had time, we could talk about what all that is. Now, I don't want to make you too nervous, because I can sense that some of you are sort of are saying in your mind, I don't know about this. Gospel dependent on each other? Why would Matthew need to depend upon somebody else when he had the Holy Spirit inspiring him? Well, here's a small warrant for this kind of use of sources. And all that would be, if Matthew were using Mark as a source, it would be just that, using a source. And what we find is that Luke tells us very clearly in Luke 1 through 4, that there were other gospels. And then he tells us that these attempts at writing the other gospels were according to the early oral traditions. And Luke numbers himself among the many. He decides to investigate his sources and write an orderly account. So Luke very clearly says that he used sources. There's nothing that denies inspiration or in any way denies God's authority in understanding that there might have been the use of sources. So don't let that bother you. Source criticism really is nothing more than an attempt to discover from Luke and from the other gospel writers what sources they used. And by better understanding their sources, we can better understand their intentions. And what little aspect of Jesus they're pointing to in that particular pericope. So the Gospels are the story of Jesus. The Synoptics tell basically the same story. John, the things that are in John are in essence unique. We don't have them anywhere else. The story is that John's Gospel was written much later than the Synoptics. And as a result of that, John knew what the Synoptics had written and wanted to write stories that had not been preserved. Whether that's true or not is very difficult for us to tell. But we do know that those stories that we have in John are unique. For example, there's only one miracle that occurs in all four of the Gospels, and that is the feeding of the 5,000, probably for apologetic reasons. So, because there were so many people who were there at that feeding, 20,000 people, and other people obviously heard about it and knew about it. So putting that in there and having so many people that could attest to its truthfulness was probably an apologetic tool by the gospel writers. But much of John, both in tone, in substance, and in just pure intent, is very different from Matthew and Mark and Luke. And that's why sometimes when people become a Christian, someone will tell them to read the Gospel of John first. I generally don't think that's as good an idea. The Gospel of John begins with these philosophical concepts, the Word, God was the Word, and there was a man. It's difficult. On the other hand, Mark is a very quick gospel in its stories. It's like Jesus did this, and then he did this, and then immediately he did this, and then immediately he did this. And so I think that Mark, as a gospel, is a wonderful thing to tell people to read first if they want to know about Jesus. I think it's a great introduction. And then they can read John or whatever else, but I think this is a great introduction.